They called her name, and the gavel rose. In that single heartbeat, she understood her life might be measured in dollars and shame. But just as the crowd leaned forward, a voice broke through the murmur, steady as a rifle shot, ending the bidding with a sum no one dared to challenge. The late autumn sun hung low over the dusty Montana town. Its light filtered through wood smoke and grit. Eleanor Hayes, her wrists raw from rope, stood trembling on the makeshift platform outside the saloon. A girl raised on nothing but hard ground and harder luck, she had been sold once before to poverty, to hunger, to the silence of abandonment. Today was meant to seal her fate. Men gathered, eyes sharp as blades, purses clutched in greedy hands. Some looked at her as if she were a horse to be broken, others as if she were already theirs. Then he stepped forward. Daniel Mercer was no stranger to this frontier stage rancher, widower, and a man who carried grief like a second shadow. His hat brim cast his face in shade, but his voice carried over the crowd, calm, final. The figure he named made the gavel fall with a crack like thunder. In that instant, Eleanor was no longer property of the highest bidder. She belonged to no man. She belonged only to fate, and fate had chosen Daniel. The crowd muttered, disappointed, some even angered. Daniel ignored them. He moved through the dust with the certainty of someone who had buried too many illusions to care about opinion. When he reached her, he cut the ropes with a blade worn smooth from use, not ornament. Eleanor staggered, the weight of freedom heavier than chains. She wanted to speak, but her throat closed against the storm of humiliation, fear, and something else, a spark of disbelief that anyone would intervene. Daniel's hand steadied her elbow, not possessive, but protective. It was enough to guide her down from the platform, enough to remind her she still stood on her own 2 feet. The crowd parted in silence as he led her away. A woman half-broken yet unbowed. A man carrying scars as visible as hers, though hidden beneath his coat. That night, the wind shifted. From the porch of his homestead, Eleanor saw the expanse of prairie stretched wide, a canvas of stars above. She should have felt safe, but safety was foreign to her bones. She wrapped her arms tight around herself, listening to the horses settling in the barn, the scrape of Daniel's boots across the floorboards inside. He had bought her freedom. That truth would not change. But in the hollow of her chest grew a question more dangerous than chains. What would she do with it now? The prairie night answered only with silence. Eleanor did not sleep that first night beneath Daniel Mercer's roof. The cabin walls groaned in the wind, the rafters whispered like old bones, and every creak reminded her she was not alone. She lay on a narrow cot near the hearth, staring at the shadows cast by dying embers, her mind circling the memory of the auction block. Freedom should have felt like release, but it pressed heavier than iron. She was indebted now, not with coin, but with something deeper, something she did not yet have a name for. Daniel moved about the cabin with the quiet rhythm of a man long accustomed to solitude. He did not press her with questions, nor claim conversation where silence belonged. He left a folded blanket at the edge of her cot, a gesture that felt less like kindness and more like respect. Respect was foreign to her, more unnerving than cruelty. Morning came with frost feathering the windows and a pale sun climbing over the hills. Eleanor rose before Daniel, her body stiff, her spirit restless. She found the water bucket near the door half full, the axe buried in the chopping block outside. The tasks of survival presented themselves in their simple, merciless order. Draw water, split wood, feed the fire. She did them all, her breath white in the cold air. Each swing of the axe a declaration that she would not rot into helplessness. Daniel watched from the barn doorway, his hat pushed back, arms folded across his chest. He said nothing until she finally looked up, her hair damp with sweat, her shoulders quivering with exhaustion. "You don't owe me that," he said, voice low, certain. But Eleanor felt otherwise. Debt was the only language she had ever known. She straightened, gripping the axe handle until her knuckles whitened. "I owe you everything," she thought, though the words did not leave her lips. Instead, she set another log on the block and swung again. The day unfolded in silence, broken only by the scrape of tools and the distant calls of crows circling the tree line. Daniel repaired the fence that bordered the south pasture, while Eleanor swept the cabin floor until the wood shone raw beneath her efforts. By nightfall, her body ached, but her spirit hummed with something almost like defiance. She would not be a burden. When Daniel returned, he carried a sack of flour slung over his shoulder and the scent of cold earth on his coat. He paused at the sight of her work, the swept floor, the stacked wood, the simmering pot of beans she had coaxed from his sparse pantry. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, half surprise, half recognition. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed on the fire. She had not done it for gratitude. She had done it because the thought of sitting idle beneath the weight of his mercy was more suffocating than chains. Outside, the wind rose, scattering pine needles across the clearing. Inside, an unspoken vow took root between them, delicate as frost and just as dangerous. The second morning broke colder than the first. A thin crust of snow coated the ground outside, turning the world into a brittle silence. Eleanor stepped out onto the porch, pulling Daniel's spare shawl around her shoulders, though she resented its comfort. Every breath of frosted air reminded her she was alive, not because of her own will, but because one man had raised his voice when no one else dared. In the distance, Daniel's cattle moved like dark shapes across the pale hills. He rode among them, sure in his saddle, the figure of a man who belonged to this land as much as the pines and rivers did. Eleanor watched until the horizon swallowed him, then turned back inside. The cabin felt too large without him, too filled with echoes of a life that was not hers. She set herself to tasks again. The water bucket needed filling, the beans soaking, the hearth sweeping. Each act was small, ordinary, but each held the edge of desperation. If she worked hard enough, perhaps she could carve a place here that wasn't built on charity. Yet, with every strike of broom against floorboard, the memory of the auction block returned. The voices, the laughter, the gavel's final crack. The shame clung like smoke, and even Daniel's intervention could not erase the mark left on her soul. By afternoon, Daniel returned. His gloves were stiff with ice, his beard frosted white. He dismounted slowly, shoulders heavy with more than labor. Eleanor met him at the door with a steaming tin of coffee she had brewed strong. He accepted it with a nod, his eyes meeting hers briefly before turning away. Gratitude without words, she found it easier to bear than pity. That evening, the wind grew fierce, rattling the shutters and filling the cabin with a mournful hum. Daniel sat at the table mending tack, while Eleanor stitched a tear in her only dress by the firelight. The rhythm of needle and thread steadied her hands, but not her heart. At last she spoke, voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. "Why?" Daniel looked up, his hands pausing on the leather strap. "Why what? Why did you stop them?" She kept her eyes on the fabric, unwilling to see what truth might live in his expression. A long silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackle of flames. Finally, his voice came, quiet but sure. "Because I couldn't stand by and watch." She swallowed hard. Mercy was heavier than cruelty. Cruelty, she knew how to fight. Mercy demanded she believe she was worth saving. The storm battered the walls, snow drifting against the door, as Eleanor stitched her last thread. She did not thank him. She could not. But in the quiet of that winter night, she realized something more binding than debt had already begun to take shape. A tether, invisible, fragile, yet impossible to deny. Winter deepened, and with it, the silence between them. Days stretched long beneath a sky the color of pewter, each hour measured by the scrape of chores and the hiss of wind against the cabin walls. Eleanor found her rhythm: mend, sweep, cook, carry. But the rhythm only reminded her of the emptiness that had shadowed her for years. She was free, yes, but freedom felt as cold as the snowdrifts rising higher against the porch rails. Daniel bore the season differently. He rose before dawn, his lantern bobbing in the pre-dawn dark, as he tended cattle and broke ice from the troughs. He returned each evening with the weight of labor on his shoulders and the frost of loneliness still clinging to his beard. They shared meals, shared silence, and shared a space where words dared not bloom. Yet the world beyond their cabin had not forgotten her. When Daniel rode to town for supplies, whispers followed him about the woman he'd saved, the stranger living under his roof. Some said she was a runaway, others a thief, still others something worse. The truth mattered little. Gossip had teeth, and those teeth sought blood. One evening, Daniel set a sack of flour on the table, more heavily than he meant to. Eleanor glanced up from the hearth, sensing the storm in his posture. "They talk," he said simply, his voice tight. Her hands stilled. She did not ask what they said, she already knew. Townsfolk never lacked imagination when it came to a woman with no past worth telling. "I told them it was none of their concern," Daniel added, softer now. His eyes met hers across the firelight, steady but weary. "But you should know." Eleanor lowered her gaze to the flames, her throat thick. Shame rose like smoke, curling through her ribs. She had lived her life beneath suspicion, judged before she could speak. But this was different. Here, her presence carved shadows over a man who had shown her nothing but respect. That night, she did not sleep. She lay awake, staring at the beams overhead, her thoughts circling like wolves. By dawn, she had made a decision. When Daniel stepped outside to saddle his horse, Eleanor gathered the small bundle of belongings she owned: threadbare shawl, worn boots, the Bible her mother had pressed into her hands before dying. She paused at the door, her breath misting in the frigid air. To stay would mean binding Daniel to the weight of her shame. To leave would mean facing the world alone once more. Her hand hovered over the latch. Behind her, the fire snapped, casting long shadows that seemed to whisper of both refuge and exile. She closed her eyes, a single thought burning in her chest. Freedom was hers again, but freedom came at a cost. And perhaps the cost was leaving, before the man who saved her lost everything in the storm of her past. The bundle sat heavy in Eleanor's arms, though it contained almost nothing. She lingered at the threshold, her breath turning white in the cold, her heart louder than the wind outside. She had planned to leave before Daniel returned from the pasture, but fate rarely bends to plans. His boots crunched over the frozen ground before she could slip away, his silhouette filling the doorway with the weight of questions unasked. Daniel's gaze dropped to the bundle, then lifted back to her face. He did not reach for her, nor did his voice rise. Instead, it carried the calm certainty of a man who had already buried too much to fear losing more. "You were leaving," he said. Eleanor clutched the bundle tighter, shame burning through her veins. "They talk," she whispered. "Every time you ride into town, they stain your name because of me. I won't let that ruin fall on you." The silence that followed was heavier than accusation. Daniel removed his gloves slowly, setting them on the table as though each movement anchored him. His eyes, steady as the Montana hills, never wavered. "Do you think I saved you to protect a name?" he asked at last. Her throat closed. She wanted to say yes, because believing otherwise was more dangerous than the wolves that roamed the timberline. But Daniel's presence held no hint of possession, only a patience that scraped against her defenses. "You don't owe me your leaving," he continued, "and you don't owe me your staying. But don't mistake the noise of town for truth. They gossip because they don't know you. I do." Eleanor's knees weakened. The words pierced deeper than pity, deeper than kindness. He claimed to know her, a woman whose story was carved from abandonment and shame. And still, he stood before her, unflinching. The bundle slipped from her grasp, thudding against the floorboards. For a moment, she could not breathe, torn between flight and surrender. Her entire life had been an escape from poverty, from betrayal, from the judgment of strangers. Staying was a new kind of risk, one she feared more than any auction block. Daniel stepped aside, leaving the doorway open to the snow-laden pines. "If you want to walk out, I won't stop you," he said. His voice held no command, only truth. "But if you stay because you choose it, not because of debt, not because of chains, not because of me." The wind swept into the cabin, carrying the sharp scent of pine and the bite of winter. Eleanor stood at the threshold of her own heart, every scar urging her to run. Yet something steadier stirred beneath the fear, a longing as fragile and fierce as fire in a storm. Slowly, she bent to pick up the bundle. Then, with hands trembling but resolute, she set it back inside the cabin. For the first time since the gavel fell, she had chosen. The thaw had not yet come, but winter's grip had loosened just enough for the earth to soften. Mud pooled in the wagon ruts outside town, and wolves came closer to the herds, desperate with hunger. Daniel mended fence posts at the far edge of his pasture, his shoulders bent against a wind that smelled faintly of storm. Eleanor carried kindling from the tree line, her shawl pulled tight, her mind heavy with the choice she had made to stay. She had not spoken much since dropping her bundle. Choosing to remain did not erase the weight of fear, it only changed its shape. Now every glance toward the horizon carried the question: what new cost would this frontier demand? The answer came sooner than she expected. That afternoon, hoofbeats thundered over the ridge. 3 riders, strangers draped in dust and menace, cut across the fence line as though it were not there. Eleanor froze, clutching the kindling to her chest. The men slowed when they saw her, grins splitting their faces like cracks in old leather. "Well, look here," one drawled, reining his horse close. "Didn't know Mercer kept company now. And such pretty company, too." Her blood ran cold. She had known men like this before, the kind who saw survival as weakness, who fed on fear. Daniel appeared then, striding from the pasture with his rifle slung low but ready. His voice carried calm steel. "You've crossed my land without asking. Turn back." The leader's grin widened, but it held no warmth. "Just paying neighborly respects. Can't help noticing you've got yourself a woman. Folks in town say she's worth more than you bargained for." Eleanor's stomach twisted. Even here, whispers hunted her. Daniel's stance did not shift. "This land doesn't welcome trespassers," he said, his voice colder than the wind. "Ride on." A tense silence stretched, broken only by the restless snorts of the horses. Then, with a laugh too sharp to be harmless, the men wheeled their mounts and thundered back over the ridge, vanishing into the gray horizon. Eleanor's knees nearly buckled with relief, but Daniel's jaw remained tight. He slung the rifle back over his shoulder, his gaze scanning the tree line long after the riders were gone. Inside the cabin that evening, the fire cast long, restless shadows. Eleanor sat near the hearth, her hands wrapped around a tin cup, though she barely drank. Daniel's presence filled the room like a storm held at bay. "They'll be back," he said quietly. She met his eyes then, finding no fear in them, only resolve. For the first time, she understood the cost of staying was not only her reputation, but also his safety. Yet when he added, "And when they come, we'll be ready," a spark caught inside her chest. Not we as in debt, not we as in rescue, but we as in together. The cabin walls held the night, but the threat beyond them lingered. Eleanor sat by the hearth, stitching a tear in Daniel's coat with hands that trembled more from memory than cold. Each prick of the needle carried her back to the riders' leering smiles, the way their laughter clung to the wind even after they had gone. She had thought chains and gavel were the worst the world could offer. Now she knew it had other ways of reminding her she was prey. Daniel moved about the room with a steadiness that belied the tension in his jaw. He set another log on the fire, the sparks leaping like small stars between them. "I'll ride the fence line at first light," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "If they're bold enough to cross once, they'll test it again." Eleanor bit back her instinct to argue. Fear clawed at her throat, but she swallowed it. She had chosen to stay, chosen to stand in this life rather than flee. To protest now would only make her choice hollow. Instead, she tied off the last stitch and held the mended coat toward him. Daniel accepted it with a nod. His hand brushed hers, rough calluses against fragile skin, and for a heartbeat neither moved. In that silence lay something unspoken, heavier than fear, lighter than mercy. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly, eyes steady on hers. "Not to me, not to anyone." Her lips parted, but no words came. For years, her worth had been measured in what others could take, in what she could endure. To hear him deny that ledger cut deeper than any insult. She turned away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. The wind howled against the shutters, rattling them in their frames. Daniel set his rifle within arm's reach of the table before settling into the chair opposite her. The fire crackled between them, its glow softening the hard lines of his face. "Why do you care?" she whispered, the words slipping free before she could stop them. Daniel's gaze did not waver. "Because I've seen what it is to lose everything, and I won't stand by while the world tries to take more from someone who deserves better." Her chest tightened, torn between disbelief and the fragile ache of hope. She pressed her palms to the cup in her lap, drawing what warmth she could. No man had ever spoken of her in such a way, not as a burden, not as a transaction, but as someone worthy of defending simply because she existed. That night, when she lay down near the fire, sleep came slowly. But when it did, it came with the faintest sense of safety. A feeling so rare it frightened her more than wolves at the door. Outside, the prairie winds carried whispers of coming trials. Inside, in the flicker of firelight, two souls carried promises neither dared to name. The next morning dawned gray, the sun a pale coin hidden behind clouds. Frost clung to the fence rails, and the cattle moved uneasily, their breath misting in the brittle air. Daniel saddled his horse before the light had fully broken, his rifle strapped across his back. His eyes narrowed against the wind. Eleanor watched from the porch, shawl wrapped tight, her heart pounding as though it knew what he would find. By midday the horizon answered her fear. A column of smoke rose where none should be, twisting against the winter sky. Daniel returned at a gallop, mud caked on his boots and urgency carved into his face. "They've burned a line of my pasture," he said, dismounting in one fluid motion. His voice carried no panic, only iron. "It's a warning." Eleanor's hands clenched around the railing. The riders had not forgotten. They wanted more than mischief, they wanted control, the kind that thrived on fear. She felt the weight of her past settle again, convinced their menace was drawn as much to her presence as to Daniel's land. As night fell, unease thickened. Daniel kept his rifle near, his eyes sharp whenever the wind shifted. Eleanor moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, laying extra wood by the fire, preparing a kettle of water. Her body remembered survival's rituals, though her spirit trembled with each distant echo of hoofbeats that might only be her imagination. Then, near midnight, the hoofbeats came for real. 3 shadows emerged from the tree line, horses snorting steam into the frigid dark. The riders circled the clearing, their laughter low, taunting. One loosed a shot into the air, the crack splitting the night. Eleanor froze, her pulse roaring in her ears. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, rifle raised, his silhouette framed by firelight spilling from the open door. "You've had your fun," he called, voice steady as bedrock. "Turn back now, or the next shot won't be a warning." For a moment, the clearing held its breath. The riders reined in, eyes glinting with malice. Then the leader leaned forward in his saddle, his words cutting through the cold. "You can't guard her forever, Mercer. Sooner or later, debts get paid." Eleanor flinched, as though struck. Daniel's stance did not falter. The rifle stayed fixed, his voice calm but edged like steel. "This land is mine, and so is the choice of who I stand beside. Ride on, or you won't ride again." The silence cracked with tension. Then, with a sneer, the riders wheeled their horses and vanished back into the timber, their threat lingering heavier than smoke. Inside, Eleanor's hands shook as she closed the door behind Daniel. The fire hissed, the walls groaned, and in the fragile stillness between them, she realized something terrifying. Danger would not stop until one of them broke, and she was no longer certain which would come first, the riders or her own heart. The riders' threat lingered long after their hoofbeats faded. Smoke from the burned pasture drifted across the valley, acrid and bitter, a reminder that peace was as fragile as frost. Daniel rebuilt the fence in silence, each strike of his hammer echoing like a vow. But Eleanor felt the weight of his resolve pressing against the shadows of her own history. She had thought she left Boston behind the auction, the shame, the whispered accusations of theft and ruin. But whispers travel faster than wagons, and rumors do not die on command. At the general store in Willowbrook, She felt the stairs follow her like burrs on a hem. Women turned away when she passed, and men muttered about Mercer's charity project. Each word carved another wound into her spirit. One afternoon, as she loaded flour into Daniel's wagon, a familiar name caught her ear. Whitmore. Her breath stilled. Charles Whitmore, her estranged husband, the man who had cast her aside, who had left her to the wolves of society, was rumored to be traveling west in search of new investments. And if that rumor proved true, he would not only find land to exploit, he might find her. That night, Eleanor sat by the hearth, her hands clasped tight in her lap. Daniel noticed the way her shoulders tensed, the way her eyes refused the fire's warmth. "What is it?" he asked, voice low but steady. She swallowed hard. To confess meant dragging her past into his present. To remain silent meant letting it poison her in secret. At last, the truth forced its way out, brittle as glass. "I was married," she whispered. "Legally, I still am. Charles Whitmore never filed the papers. To the law, I belong to him." The words hung heavy in the cabin, thicker than the smoke curling from the chimney. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his eyes did not harden. Instead, he studied her with a steadiness that made her want to collapse. "You should have told me sooner," he said at last. His voice carried no anger, only quiet resolve. Tears stung her eyes. "I wanted to, but shame has a way of binding tighter than rope, and I feared." Her voice broke. "I feared you'd send me away." Daniel set aside his tools and came closer, the firelight gilding the lines of weariness etched in his face. "Eleanor, I didn't save you from the block to trade one set of chains for another. Whatever he was, whatever the law claims, he has no claim here. Not while I draw breath." Her heart twisted. Hope flared, dangerous and bright. Yet even as his words soothed, the echo of the rider's threat rang louder. Debts get paid. And she understood then. Her past would not remain buried. It was riding toward her, as certain as the storm rolling over the mountains, ready to test every fragile thing she and Daniel had begun to build. The storm came with iron skies, and a wind that howled like wolves through the pines. Snow lashed against the cabin walls, rattling shutters and burying tracks before they could settle. Inside, the fire roared, but its warmth could not reach the cold that had lodged in Eleanor's chest. Each gust of wind felt like a harbinger. Each creak of timber whispered of debts circling closer. At dusk, hoofbeats pierced the gale. Not one horse, many. Daniel rose from the table, his hand closing around the rifle, his jaw set hard. Eleanor stood frozen, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Through the window's frost, she saw them. The three riders from before, joined by two more, their silhouettes swaying in the storm's half-light. One carried a lantern that swung like a threat. Another raised his voice above the wind. "Mercer, come out and make this easy. We've business to settle." Daniel's eyes never left the window. "Stay by the fire," he told her, his tone leaving no room for argument. But Eleanor's body rebelled. She had been silent too long, hiding behind fear, letting others fight her battles. The riders were not only here for land or cattle. They were here because of her, because gossip and shame had painted her as a prize worth claiming or breaking. She stepped beside him, her hand brushing his sleeve. "If I hide, they'll never stop," she whispered. "I have to face them." Daniel's gaze flickered, storm and fire mingling in his eyes. At last he gave a single nod. Together they opened the door. Snow blasted in, the lantern light casting monstrous shadows across the clearing. The leader sneered, his teeth glinting. "There she is, the runaway. Thought you could vanish, did you? Men back east pay good money for word of a wife gone missing. Whitmore might even pay double." Eleanor's blood turned to ice. Charles's name, spoken aloud, cracked the fragile shell she had built. But when she felt Daniel's steady presence at her side, her spine straightened. "She's not yours to sell," Daniel said, rifle raised. The leader spat into the snow. "Everything has a price." "No," Eleanor said, her voice slicing through the storm. It was the first time she had spoken into danger without trembling. "Not everything. Not me. Not anymore." The riders shifted. caught off guard by the steel in her tone. The storm howled, snow swirling around them like ash. For a heartbeat, the clearing held its breath. Then, with a snarl, the leader drew his pistol. The world narrowed to firelight, gunmetal, and choice. Daniel's finger tightened on the trigger, and Eleanor's heart surged with one final truth. This was not just his fight, it was hers too. The first shot cracked the night. The shot split the storm. Muzzle flash lit the clearing, briefly painting the riders in fire. Daniel's rifle roared a heartbeat later, echoing across the frozen hills. Horses reared, snow churned, and chaos swallowed the night. Eleanor dropped to her knees as a bullet struck the porch rail, splintering wood inches from her. Fear surged, but she refused to yield. Crawling to the doorframe, she seized Daniel's spare revolver from the table inside. The cold metal burned against her palm, but her grip did not falter. The riders scattered, their leader cursing as he wrestled his horse back under control. Two fled into the trees, their courage breaking beneath the storm. The others fired wildly, their shots muffled by wind and panic. Daniel stood unshaken, his rifle a steady thunder in the night. Each round drove the attackers farther, until only the leader remained. He circled wide, lantern swinging. His sneer turned desperate. "She's mine by law," he shouted. "You can't change that, Mercer. A man doesn't lose his claim." The words cut deep, but Eleanor rose to her feet, stepping into the storm's teeth. Snow stung her cheeks, yet her voice carried clear. "Law may call me his, but I choose my freedom. I choose my life, and I will not be owned again." For the first time, the leader hesitated. His sneer faltered. Then Daniel leveled the rifle, his tone quiet, final. "You heard her." The man spat into the snow, rage and defeat mingling in his eyes. With a harsh yank of his reins, he turned his horse and vanished into the storm's fury. Silence fell, broken only by the wind sighing through the pines. Eleanor swayed, the revolver heavy in her hand. Daniel crossed the distance, steadying her with arms that felt more like refuge than restraint. She pressed her forehead against his chest, her breath breaking free in sobs she had buried for years. "You're safe now," he murmured, though his voice trembled with exhaustion. "No one will take you again." In that moment, Eleanor understood. Safety was not the absence of danger, but the presence of someone willing to stand beside her when it came. Daniel had given her that, and she, in turn, would spend her life giving it back. Weeks later, as spring returned and wildflowers broke through thawing earth, the cabin stood stronger, its walls mended, its hearth warm. Eleanor walked the porch with a steady step, her shawl catching the sunlight. Daniel worked the pasture, his figure framed by the endless Montana sky. She was no longer a woman bound to shame, nor a soul waiting for rescue. She was partner, builder, and beloved. And when evening fell, she whispered into the prairie wind, "You saved me from the auction block, but love that I'll spend my life giving back." If this story stirred your heart, if you believe love can be forged in fire, storm, and sacrifice, then subscribe to Western Love Legends for more tales like this. Don't forget to like and share, because every week, another story waits to remind us that hope still rides the frontier.